There we go. Okay, well, welcome to June. This is my Don't Panic talk about insects and diseases. And I'm just going to say right now to reassure you that although you're going to see lots of examples of things that could be a problem, in any given garden, there's usually just a couple of things that might be every year a problem, like cabbage root maggot, carrot rust fly. You can count on them. Most of us will have them every year. And once you know what to do, you just routinely do it. And then you're done worrying about them for the rest of the crop. So it's not like you're going to see all this stuff that are in my slides. You're going to see some of it and you're going to get used to how to prevent it. And then I hope it's going to be kind of smooth sailing from there. I mean, the tent caterpillars were almost over the hump. They won't be back for another 10 years. So we can forget about them. Most people do forget about them, and it comes as a big surprise when we have another outbreak. But they'll be back. So June, what to do this month? Well, we're in the middle of June, and this is a perfect time to start from seed the overwintering broccoli and the wintering cauliflower. And if you'll remember, if you need to review, go back to the slides when I was talking about the spring garden, the differences between the broccolis, because they're not the same varieties. So if you get a snow crown cauliflower, which is a summertime cauliflower, an annual cauliflower, it will not be hardy and it will not produce cauliflower next spring. So you got to get the right varieties. And then we start them about now or by the end of June. Or you can wait now. People on Salt Spring, Chorus Frog will have a good selection of the right stuff. They know what to do. And people over in Vancouver Island, there will be a sale on the 1st of August, around the 1st of August at the Compost Education Center. And there's a group in Nanaimo. So I will publish those in my Linda's list of any of the things that I know. But if you're buying from a regular conventional plant nursery, garden center, read the labels, because the wholesalers don't know or don't care, because I've been railing about this for about 20 years, that they're sending you the wrong stuff. So read the label for the variety names and don't buy the summer varieties when it gets to be the middle of the summer. So keep on planting lettuce and radishes, and anything you planted 6 weeks ago is probably getting like greens, leafy greens and things. They're getting huge, and you'll want some different ones later. There's still time to plant peas and bush beans. You've got up till the end of June at least to plant those. And as I was mentioning right before the class tonight, you might want to plant a few more zucchini seeds. If you get a variety that's a 45 or 50-day variety, you can seed that on the 30th of June, and they will start producing later in August and do August, September, October. You probably are, if you've got fruit trees, you're probably noticing that you've got to do some thinning. And now the June drop seems to be proceeding pretty well at my house, and it's time to be thinning fruit. If you want to review that, just have a look at last month's slides. And any water sprouts that are coming out on branches, those are the vertical growing, very soft, lush, straight up little growths coming. Just pull them off. They'll break easily. Just grab them and pull them back and they'll snap right off. And keep pinching your grapes and kiwis. They're going to have lots and lots of shoots. And it's time now to decide which grape clusters to keep. You just want to keep one per cane. And some varieties will have like 3 on there right now. So just cut off the ones that look the youngest or the smallest. And if you didn't mulch last month, I hope everybody did mulch before that really hot weather, but now is time to get her done. So before I proceed though, any questions about this before I start diving into bugs and more?
I have a question.
Sure.
Going just with the mulch and the irrigation, we have a drip irrigation.
Mm-hmm.
Should the line be on top of the mulch or under the mulch?
Under's perfect. Just mulch right over the top. Yeah.
Right.
The only problem with mulching over the top is you don't remember where it is, and then you might put your garden fork in it. But anyway, as long as you're not, I periodically do this myself. So, but it is actually great to have it mulch right over it. It protects the plastic too from the sun.
Okay.
But it also, the water stays underneath the mulch, which is where we want it. We don't want it evaporating away on the surface of the mulch.
Great, thanks. That's kind of what I thought, but
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Linda, I have a question. I have a composter that needs emptying.
Mhm.
Can I mulch with that compost? Or is that just kind of wasting the
Well, it's kind
compost?
of a waste. I
Yeah.
mean, if you've got anything else that's loose and
Right.
fluffy, I mean, that compost should be used.
I know it's the
to
gold,
enrich
but
the soil,
yeah.
unless it's really rough and not composted much. But
Mm,
you know, what we're looking for a summer mulch is something that will keep the soil cool and kind of reflect the sunlight in a way, which so leaves and straw and organic matter and, you know, I mean, even your lawn grass, I mean, any of those things will basically anything you get your hands on. And if all you've got is the compost, you could use it.
thanks.
Okay, so tonight I'm going to review life cycles first of insects, just because there can be some confusion as to what comes first, the larva, the egg, or the pupa, and also talk about fungal life cycles. And then I'm going to talk about preventing pests, how we're going to identify problems, how to know when to take action or not, because lots of times we don't actually have to do anything. And then the toolbox, what control methods do we have that are least toxic, non-toxic? And now there's a reference section on this set of slides, and it's quite extensive, and going into vegetable pests, fruit pests, vegetable diseases, fruit diseases in each section. We won't get to all of that, and maybe at the end, if we have time, I'll take requests, but it's there as a reference. So remember, you can download these slides as long as you do it before Christmas, and keep them if you need them as a review. And this might be one module that's worth downloading as a reference section. And then you've seen some of these slides before, because when I talked about how to grow carrots, for example, or how to grow cabbage family, I already talked about the key pest for each of those. So that'll be a bit of a review. So again, but just remember it's here as a reference section that's all in one place appended to the end of this one. But before I do any of this, I want to talk about 5 simple rules. And if you could remember those, I think that actually they're the main takeaway from this whole night, which is the first one is if it's flying around your garden during the day, it's not a pest. All this stuff is not pests. The only exception, there's one exception, and it's this white butterfly, not a moth. It's a white cabbage butterfly, and the caterpillars, which get called imported cabbage worms when they're caterpillars, so go figure. These little guys chew up our cabbage and kale. But all of these other things that fly around during the day, they may have nothing to do with your garden, or they may be predators or pollinators or parasites or just pretty butterflies, but they're not, and they're not pests. The pests, a lot of them are nocturnal. A lot of them are on leaves. You might find them in the garden during the day, but they're rolled up in a leaf, or they're on the underside of a leaf, or they're down in the foliage, but they're not flying around. Number 2 is if something that lives in and around and on the soil moves quickly, it's a predator. It's almost, in fact, I've just found one of these again today. This is a baby ground beetle. This will be this beetle when it finally matures. There are a lot of these, and they wiggle really fast. I mean, they're not like worms at all. They really motor, and centipedes really motor. Whereas millipedes curl right up in a little ball. They don't motor around at all. And they're not, millipedes eat plant material and fungi and things in the soil. They're just eating things that can't run. But creatures that have to eat other creatures can move pretty fast. They can surprise you a bit. This is a key message. Most pathogens, or microbes that cause disease, and most pests only attack their specific host plants. So, and a lot of them are restricted to only one or just a few closely related plants. So this is a picture of apple scab, and this is pear scab, and those are 2 different fungi. And apple scab won't go on pears, pear scab won't go on apples, and none of them will go on any other kind of tree or fruit. So it's very specific. When it comes to aphids, you might think there's aphids. Aphids are everywhere, but the aphids that are on roses, like this, are completely different species than green peach aphid or a cabbage aphid or this plum aphid. And they're not going to move around to their other host plants. They stick to their host plant. So it may be the kind of weather that, causes aphids to, reproduce really well. But they won't be all just switching around. So don't worry about if you see aphids on one thing that they're going to attack everything else. And that holds for most, that's the majority of pathogens and pests stick to their host plants. And actually, most of the problems that really cause the worst damage in our food crops are what are called disorders, or they may be called abiotic disorders, or you may hear the term environmental disorders. They're not caused by another organism. They're caused by something wrong with the growing environment. And that could be nutrient deficiencies, could be just injury. It could be poor watering practice. Look at these potatoes. That's just the irrigation system broke down in a hot summer. Extreme temperature does a lot of damage that isn't quite obvious as being extreme temperature. It can look a lot like disease. And chemical damage. Soaps are chemicals. People spray soap on plants and damage their leaves. And it's a burn and it looks like a disease. So I think the most damage that actually happens can be as a result of things that are not microbes and they're not pests. And number 5 is, this is really key, despite finding damage, there may still be no need to take action. Or, I mean, it may be that it's impossible to take action because you found the damage too late. If it was a creature that was eating a leaf and it's finished eating the leaf and left the plant, there's nothing you can do about that. But there are a lot of cases where the damage isn't really damaging. This is a blister mites on grapes. They're quite common. They make these puckers from the top and from underside. These are microscopically small mites. They don't hurt the grapes. They don't hurt the plant. It's just leave them. They don't have any effect on your harvest. So it's cosmetic damage. It may be that controls are too expensive or required to do something you don't want to use. That's possible. But often there's just enough natural enemies present that if you just wait, they will control the problem. And I'll show you several examples of that in the next sets of slides. And again, as I mentioned, you just may notice the damage too late to do anything about it anyway. So it's not a given that you have to do anything. You'll need to decide based on examining and following the problem, whether there's anything that needs to be done. And I'll talk more about that too. But first, to sort of get everybody on the same page about insect life cycles. Insects all start as eggs. Somebody lays an egg somewhere. And most insects proceed through a growth pathway that involves metamorphosis. So if you think of a butterfly, it starts as an egg and then hatches out to a little caterpillar. And eventually the caterpillar makes a chrysalis, and inside that, the butterfly is formed. And so there's this complete change from the larval stage to the adult stage. They look completely different. They eat a different diet. So the adults don't compete with their offspring for food, and the adults can fly, and most of the larvae of these insects can't get around very well. Their mother has to put the egg in the right spot, and the creature just stays there and eats. If it's a leaf eater, it stays and eats that leaf. And if it's a aphid predator, she'll put the eggs right in the middle of an aphid colony and it'll just stay there and eat aphids. So that's the majority of insects, egg, larva, the pupa, the intermediate stage where the larval tissues all break down and a different set of genes kicks in and makes out of it, it's just like a miracle. It's totally a miracle. This goop that's inside that was the larva becomes reorganized and changes into adult tissue. And then the adult comes out. So typically beetles, like any beetle, this is lady beetles, eggs, out of the eggs, the larvae are teeny, they're only the size of the egg when they come out. So they keep eating and shedding their skin and getting bigger and bigger and bigger until this is about the size of a lady beetle. And it attaches its little tail, hangs head down. And now the pupa stage, the insects can't walk around or fly or bite. So they can't defend themselves. So most of them look fairly camouflaged, or they're in out of the way places. A lot of them are in the soil, and they're trying to stay out of the reach of birds and predators. And you'll see an adult is beginning to develop under here. This is the wings. And then when she's done, she splits open this old pupa case, and comes out and hardens in the air. In the presence of oxygen, the exoskeleton will harden and darken, and the spots will come out. And here's her wings hanging down. She's got to fold them all up. She's got to get this all right before she can fly anywhere. Here's the white cabbage butterfly. She lays eggs on the cabbage family plant. Only this was a bad choice because it happened to be a purple Brussels sprout, and birds pick these off almost immediately because they can see them really well. And the larvae has to eat the food that it's on. And there's the pupa case, the chrysalis. It'll crawl away somewhere and spin this a little silken strand and hold this to a stake or something, or a stalk. And then when it's finished, it'll split that case and come out and spread its wings. Sorry. I should have mentioned along with the allergies comes all the sneezing. No, we'll try and get through this class tonight. And a fly, and this is a really important fly, or one, a hoverfly or syrphid fly, because these are aphid predators. And the mother has come along and laid an egg right here in this colony of aphids. And the larvae will keep eating aphids and getting till they get huge. And then they drop to the soil. And I don't have a picture of the pupa because you'll never see one. The larvae drop to the soil, and it's just a little brown oval in the soil. And then when the adult emerges, she emerges from the soil and flies away. Now, the rest of the insects, the sort of 14% or so that are left, go through what is called gradual metamorphosis. So they change a little bit every time they grow from the egg stage onward. And they get a little bit more like an adult till the last time they shed their skin, they have wings and they're sexually mature, but there's no pupa stage in between. And the stink bugs that we were talking about earlier tonight, that's what they do. So there's eggs, there's always an egg, and the little critter that comes out, entomologists would still call it a larva, although a lot of people would call it a nymph because it doesn't really, it doesn't look like a grub. Oh, and incidentally, I should have mentioned, you'll hear a lot of different terms for larvae. Oops. Happened there. You'll hear a lot of different terms. And they're all correct if you've got the right group. So if someone says maggot, that is a fly larva. So you can call it a larva or you can call it a maggot. If they say caterpillar, it's from a butterfly or moth. Again, you can still call it a larva, or you could call it a caterpillar. You'll hear the term grub, which gets applied to a lot of things, but usually it's some kind of beetle. But larva is always the correct term. And in the case of these ones with gradual metamorphosis, you'll hear nymph used more often, but larva is always correct too. Now, in the case of these creatures, usually the larvae eat the same thing the adults do. If it's a plant sucking, if it sucks sap like a stink bug would, then the larvae do it as well. If it's a predator, like this is a predatory stink bug here, as an adult, it's eating fairly good sized insects, but as larvae, it will eat small insects or insect eggs or mites or something. And this is a red-backed stink bug that I said that it's one of the ones that's really common right now. So it starts as there's these eggs, these kind of barrel-shaped little eggs here, and out of it are coming little creatures. You can see they look like a little bug because they've got 6 legs and antennae already. They don't look like a caterpillar or a grub or a maggot. And every time they molt, their colors change a bit, but they just get more and more like an adult. They get bigger. This one's finally turning the right colors. These are wing buds. And the next time it sheds its skin, it will have the complete wings. So it's just a gradual change. So insects lay their eggs. The female insect puts her egg where the larva can get its food. So this yellow woolly bear moth or this imported cabbage worm butterfly, they've chosen a cabbage plant and stuck their eggs there because that's what the caterpillars will eat. The lady beetle has found a whole bunch of aphids and put her eggs there because that's what her little offspring need. And the same, this one is a currant worm that feeds, it's a sawfly that feeds on currants. And here's a wider view of that stink bug cluster. Very distinctive eggs. They all look like little kegs, little beer kegs with this little groove around the top. They're quite funny, but that's distinctively stink bugs. Larvae can be quite variable. These are all larvae of insects with complete metamorphosis. So here is a caterpillar, and this is a maggot. And this is actually one of the flies that lays its larvae on caterpillars, and then it burrows inside and the fly kills the caterpillar. This is a beautiful native moth. It's huge, and it has a little horn on its tail. And these are crane fly larvae called leather jackets. It's a fly maggot. This is a beetle grub, a root weevil. And this is a different beetle. And we talked earlier about European chafer, or what a lot of people call chafer beetle over on the lower mainland. It's feeds on grasses, the roots of grasses. This is what they look like. So there's kind of a lot of difference between beetle larvae. Pupae. This is a butterfly chrysalis, and this is a big moth pupa. This moth is what's called a naked pupa. Some spin a cocoon. This is a moth, that's a very small moth, that has spun a cocoon, and inside is something that looks like this, only very much smaller, but it has a cocoon to protect it. This moth pupa here, this huge one, is actually in the soil, so the soil is protecting it. They didn't spin a cocoon. If you're seeing the tent caterpillars around right now, you'll seeing a lot of cocoons being spun. Inside that is something like this, or like this. The lady beetle I showed you already. The aphid midge, which you're going to see more of in a minute, is down in the soil in a cocoon, and you would never see this because they're very, very, very tiny. But that's a pupa right there. So that's insects: eggs, larvae, pupa, adult, or eggs, larvae, nymphs, till they get big enough to be adults. Now, a lot of the fungi that cause, a lot of the pathogens that cause problems in our gardens are fungi. There are some bacterial diseases and other things, but mainly we're looking at fungi. And the simplest life cycle of a fungus is much like think of it like a plant. A spore, which is like a seed, germinates. It gets in, it's blown by the wind or splashed by water onto an ideal host plant, and maybe its leaf is nice and wet or something. And it literally germinates a little filament called a hypha. And it'll make a whole mat of these filaments as it attacks the leaf. Eventually, as it's absorbing nutrients from the plant cells, it matures and produces what's actually like a little flower stalk, and produces a spore, and the spores blow away in the wind or on water or something and find another host and germinate. So it's very much like a plant. A lot of fungi have this life cycle. However, a lot of them don't. There are some really complicated life cycles in fungi. Some require one kind of host plant where they do one life cycle, and then they move to a different host plant and do another life cycle, and then they move back to the other host plant. So I'll show you the example of pear trellis rust, which spends the winter in juniper and the summer on the pears. So if you're trying to control it on pears by doing dormant oil sprays in the winter, it's completely useless because it's not in the pears or on the pears in the wintertime. So fungi can get really weird. But basically, if you think of spores, hyphae, and then some kind of fruiting that causes spores again, most of the things that we would do to prevent fungi from spreading have to do with removing the conditions that would allow them to produce the spores. So trying to diagnose fungus diseases, the things that we consider are the host plant, because again, they're very specific. There's a group of fungi called powdery mildews that make white looking spores on plants, but they're all different. The fungus that's on squash is not the same one that is on the apples or roses, or not the same one as on delphinium. So they're actually all different species of fungi. So the one that goes on roses won't go onto your apples, for example. So the diagnosing, knowing what the host plant is key. Temperature and humidity, what's the weather has been, is important. Some fungi thrive in cool, wet weather. Last year, we had a huge wipeout on apples because of scab, apple scab, which thrived in that long, cool, wet spring. And I haven't seen any apple scab on any apples this year because it's been dry and hot through all of May when the fungi would have been spreading. But there are other fungi, the powdery mildews later in the summer, that thrive in the dry weather. And then the color of spores is diagnostic. So this is a kind of rust on chard. This is a powdery mildew, which is white. And this one on the plums is actually called brown rot because the spores are brown. How long these pathogens last is an important thing to know when you're finding out what a problem is. Some of them have a really long-lasting dormant spore. And if that's the case, you need to know that because it's going to be some management. Others, they don't overwinter or live. They can't live unless they're on living plant tissue. And so when that tissue is destroyed, they're done. They're finished. That's all you have to do. Apple scab doesn't stay on the tree in the winter. It's only on the leaves on the ground. If you destroy those leaves and compost them, then they don't infect anything. So it depends what it is. And you just need to know that there's a few nasty, really nasty pathogens that have a super dormant stage. In this case, they're both ones that live in the soil and they can be there for 20 years without the host plants being there. So you can go for 20 years thinking that, you're growing dahlias there or something. And then one day you decide to grow cabbage and the cabbage has clubroot and you'll be a terrible surprise because there's no way to tell that soil had clubroot in it. And the clubroot spores are just waiting for a cabbage root to come by and smell just the right way. That they actually detect the odor. They detect the mustard compounds in the root, and that causes the clubroot spore to germinate. But all those years, it's just been sitting there waiting for a host plant. So with this information in mind, now the key thing here is to think about prevention. I mean, that's, if you prevent problems, you don't have to make decisions about whether there's been too much damage. And it's a whole lot easier. And you don't have to fuss with things. And everything looks so nice. So first, just don't bring home problems. Be really aware where you're getting your planting stock. If people give you plants, did they dig it up out of their garden? And do you know for sure that they don't have clubroot, for example? Clubroot is more common now. On Salt Spring, it's in both of our community gardens, as far as I know. So, when you start accepting plants from people from soil from their garden, there's a risk that you're going to bring in white rot on garlic, clubroot from cabbage. And, if you buy grocery store potatoes, that's a great source of potato diseases coming into your garden. The Mother's Day poinsettias and the Mother's Day azaleas and the Christmas poinsettias are a great way to bring whiteflies into your garden, scale, things like that. So before things are allowed in, have a really, good think about where they came from. Planting stock from a garden center or somebody producing seedlings, they're in soilless mixes. And so they're safe. They come from seed and they're not in soil and you don't have that risk. But when other people are giving you plants out of their garden, you really need to know and trust that gardener. And then we want to grow healthy plants. That's really a good line of defense because even if plants become infected or attacked, if they're healthy, they will recover quicker. But plants have an immune system and the healthy plants can fight off disease, much like we do. They can get infected and resist it. And from the outside, it kind of looks like the way our immune system works. It's obviously very different from inside, but that is there and it's effective. And you can see it working here. These vigorously growing young leaves of squash are not being affected by powdery mildew. So, just making sure that we're watering correctly and that we've got the right nutrients and that the pH is right, acid soil for blueberries and higher pH for everything else. Just really upping our game in terms of care of our plants. Now, extreme weather also stresses plants. So we have to manage extreme weather. If it's too hot, we have to shade things. If it's too cold, we can throw a tarp over it. So be aware that we have to get involved. And it is making it hard. The extreme and variable weather. We've been all over the map this spring already. We've had droughts, we've broken heat records. We're back to cool and wet right now. I don't know what's going on, but anyway, higher average temperatures are one thing, but there's extended periods of extreme highs and lows. So the averages are rising, But in fact, like we're getting a colder winters. The winters, the lowest temperatures that we've been experiencing on the coast here have been decreasing for the last 30 years. But our average temperature in the winter is increasing. So that just shows you that we're getting colder colds, but warmer warms in the winter, which is very hard on plants. People are now losing some plants that we've grown for years on the coast and didn't even worry about them being hardy. And suddenly they're very badly damaged or killed. And it was like, well, wait a minute, didn't we have a warm winter? Well, we mostly had a warm winter, but we had some extreme cold within it. So, you know, we're getting some kind of nasty surprises, but it's the rapidly changing conditions, and we're just going to have to be on the ball to adapt to that and be on top of things. And we may have to change the way we grow some things. The heat waves in the summertime are really can be quite damaging. It slows growth, and the photosynthesis plants, the plants that we grow in this latitude, they stop photosynthesizing when it gets over 32, which is what, about 86, sorry, Fahrenheit. I'm sorry, I meant to change these, put the US figures in here. So it's about 86 or so. When you get up to 90, nothing is photosynthesizing. And it kills leaf cells, it kills fruit cells. Hot weather also can, you know, make some plants go to seed very quickly, some leafy greens. And at those temperatures too, the pollen is ruined on things like tomatoes and peppers. So you'll get, here's a flower falling off of this tomato plant. It was too hot. This is within my greenhouse. And you can see there's nothing wrong with the plant basically, but here's the flower is already fallen off here. And this flower is about to fall off. So it was, as soon as the temperature rises over 86, you will start losing flowers. Now, when it comes to disease, prevention is really the only option we have. So I'm still going through the preventative thinking on all of this with healthy plants and, you know, managing the bad weather and stuff. But when I specifically come to disease, that's basically all we have. We don't have a treatment for most things. A lot of pathogens that live in the soil, there's absolutely nothing you can do but, for example, rotate crops to prevent problems. So just to go back to Plant Pathology 101, the plant disease triangle, 3 things have to be present before a plant gets sick. So obviously you have to have the pathogen. Whatever organism causes the disease has to be present. The plant has to be susceptible to it. And a lot of plants might not be susceptible to it. So you have to have a susceptible plant, but you still don't get a sick plant unless the environment is right for that pathogen to reproduce and spread and grow. So our first line of defense is choosing plants. So we're going to kick this leg off the 3-legged stool, a susceptible plant. We take the susceptible plant out of the equation. Here is, you know, grow peonation virus resistant peas. And this is what that virus looks like when it gets in peas. The leaves get kind of weird and blotchy, and the peas are warty looking. And it's spread by aphids in the middle of the summer. So we almost never see it in peas that we plant in the spring, because most of the early spring peas are done by sometime in July. But peas that we're planting later, it's entirely possible that you will see a nation mosaic virus if you don't plant resistant varieties. But luckily, it's not hard at all to get the resistant varieties. Everybody's got some varieties, and you know, all the seed houses have some. For powdery mildew, this is a mildew resistant zucchini growing right in a patch of squash that has obviously got powdery mildew. Scab resistant apples and pears, clubroot resistant cabbage family. And I'll just show you, this is what happened last spring to my Gala. Royal Gala is one of the most susceptible apples to scab. It's ridiculously susceptible. And these were like the best apples that I left on the tree, but there was apple scab. This whole blossom cluster died. The leaves have marks on them. The apples have marks. And by the end of the season, this is what the apples looked like. This wasn't the worst apple. This was one of the best apples. 20 feet away is my Honeycrisp tree. Absolutely no marks on any leaves. The fruit was perfect. Every fruit was perfect. It's scab resistant. So I did nothing except choose a variety that doesn't get the disease. So I wasn't spraying, didn't have to do any pruning. It was just, it makes a huge difference. So some terminology you might see when you're looking at plant descriptions about whether they're resistant or not. You might see the term tolerant. Now that means they'll get infected, but they can still produce a crop, and reasonably good crop, unless the conditions are super favorable for the pathogen. If it's just been cold and wet and raining the entire time, then a tolerant plant might not do very well. Resistant plants are not likely to be infected. So the Honeycrisp is listed as resistant to scab, and you saw it was perfect. And if they do get infected, it's minor. Spartan apples are resistant too, but there was a few scabs on my, Spartan apples last year. If a plant is immune, it just won't get infected at all, and that's very rare. You won't usually see that listed. Now, one caveat here when we're looking at resistance descriptions is that in local regions, there's strains of these different diseases. Like late blight, for example, is a pathogen that attacks tomatoes and potatoes all over North America, but there are quite different strains in different places. So in the east of the continent, people plant late blight resistant varieties of tomatoes as their first line of defense, but those haven't worked well here at all. Just not the right strains. The strains that are here just are, they still attack the plants. So there is some local differences in some things, but generally going with resistant varieties whenever you can is always a good bet. Now that's removing the susceptible plant from the equation. We don't have a lot of opportunity to change the disease environment because it's usually what the weather is. But in a few cases we do. And peaches, for example, are attacked by a pathogen called peach leaf curl, which attacks the bud. It can only get into the swelling buds in like February or early March. But just as the buds are beginning to swell is when they're infected. Even though later, the leaves coming out later show the disease, it happened really early. And all you have to do is keep that peach tree dry for that short period of time. So growing under the overhang of a building works great. People install temporary or permanent peach porches. In England, the walled gardens would all have a glass ledge here that just went out about this far, and the peaches would be espaliated against the wall, and that would keep them just dry enough to prevent this disease. So this is actually changing the disease environment just on that plant. Late blight is another one for us because the resistant varieties are not really a good option yet. This particular pathogen, which is called a water mold, needs free water on the leaves. The leaves have to be actually wet, not just humid or damp. And they can't germinate unless that's what's happening. So if you keep your tomato leaves dry, you won't have infections. So that means don't splash irrigation water on the leaves. Don't let the plants get rained on. But it also means if you're using something like a tunnel to keep the rain off, it has to be super well ventilated, because if there's condensation in the tunnel falling down on the leaves, then they get wet. I've seen tomatoes in a conventional little tunnel. They die of late blight in June, long before the ones out in the garden are infected. So these high tunnels, though, are really good invention because they're keeping off the rain, and yet there's, they're not going to keep the plants warm, but they're keeping the plants dry, and they don't have condensation. And in this case, these potted tomatoes are being grown under the overhang here of a roof. So, or I think it's a deck or something above there. And so with care, irrigation, they're not going to get late blight. Part of changing the disease environment too is pruning for good air circulation. And this is not a feeble approach. This actually is quite effective. We do it in fruit trees, fruit bushes, even rose bushes, actually. Pruning to get to let the leaves dry out very quickly after they're wet. So as soon as the rain stops, if there's good air circulation and the leaves dry quickly, there's less likelihood that some of these pathogens will have enough of a wet period to germinate. It takes a certain number of hours for them to germinate at a certain temperature. And if the leaves get wet and then get dry before that certain number of hours passes, then you don't get an infection. And this is an apple tree the apples on the top of the tree, it's the same apple tree. This is a bottom branch that was down, it's a dwarf tree. So in up against a fence where there was a lot of weeds and vegetation, these lower branches, the apple scab is so bad that the apples couldn't develop at all. They just cracked. It's the same tree up here where the light and air circulation is good and there's no scab at all. It's the same tree. So all that is the difference in air circulation around the branches. Now, another aspect of prevention is protecting bark from injury. Anytime you get a ding, or a rub or a weed eater, a string trimmer injury, and mower dings into the bark, all of those leave an opening for pathogens to get in. And we have some pathogens here that are really common on apple and pears, apple canker. And anytime you get rubbing on a post, or I actually hate espaliers. Espaliers are always just infested with apple canker or European canker, because everywhere there's a rub mark, then this canker develops, and it develops slowly, but eventually kills the whole branch. In this case, it's going to kill the whole tree. So making sure bark is not injured is really key. A practice that we can do, I guess this really comes under removing the changing the disease environment, is if we don't, if we rotate crops, what we're doing is we're keeping the host plant that this pathogen must have in order to grow. We're taking it out of the cycle for a few years, long enough that the spores that are waiting for to hatch, basically to germinate, die first. So it's like seeds that just lose their viability. Now, some of these pathogens, and this is soil-borne ones, meaning that the pathogen stays in the soil. You might pull out your infected garlic and destroy the crop because it's ruined. But what stays behind in the soil are all the spores from that disease. However, if you wait 4 years, most of the garlic diseases can't last 4 years without having their host plant there. And most of those spores have died. Well, all of the spores have died. Some die within a year. 4 years is a good rule to shoot for, with the exception of white rot, which is a whole nother thing. But most root diseases of onions, for example, and garlic, a 4-year rotation is quite enough to starve to death the spores that were sitting there in the soil. So the highest risk group, and that's what I've talked about this before, is the onion family and potatoes. The cabbage family is a moderate risk group. It's hard for us to get a 4-year rotation in most of our gardens because most of us grow a lot of plants that are in this family. So do what you can. If you can do 2 years, that's better than nothing. Onion family, really, you have to try and do a 4-year rotation, and potatoes. But the cabbage family, you do what you can. But that's why it works, is we're simply just removing the host plant long enough that everybody starves to death. So any questions so far? I'm going to talk about what do we do when there is a problem. But any questions about the first part of prevention? If any of you get, also Backyard Bounty has this too. It's laid out the same way with prevention first. But if you happen to get a copy of my new edition of my Big Bug book, it always focuses on prevention before I move down to control. Because really, most of this can be nipped in the bud or prevented. So if anybody has a question, pop up now, or I'm going to proceed. All righty. Well, where do you start when there is a problem? The first thing you have to do is make sure you get the problem correctly identified. There are so many things that look like other things that are completely different, that if you tried to if you assumed you knew what the problem was and you were wrong, the actions you take are not going to work at best. At worst, they may actually damage the plant or cause some other problems. But once you know what you're actually dealing with, there's a lot of information around. You can look up a lot about their biology and life cycle. If it's an insect, you can find out natural enemies. And there's a lot of information around, but this big stumbling block is getting things correctly identified. And I'll just show you here I know that this looks like a plant disease. This is leaf curling midge on apples, and actually they're on apples right now. I just saw the first ones on my apples today. I just ever see a few and pick these leaves off and destroy them. And it's a midge, it's an insect that looks like a disease. This also looks like a disease, and it's I think it's Brussels sprouts with the leaves puckering and turning purple, but on the underside of the leaf, you'll find just an aphid or two. And the plants are reacting to the aphid saliva by doing this weird distortion. This little critter, I put him here because there's a lot of little caterpillars out there in the world. And depending what it is, it depends whether it's a problem or not. This happens to be winter moth, and winter moth is something that we can prevent with traps, but there's just, you can't really identify them. It's very hard to know what they are when it's just a little green worm. So yeah, it's the hardest thing to do. I mean, large holes in leaves. Well, this happens to be bird damage. A lot of people are surprised that birds damage plants. Birds can do a lot of damage. They'll rip tops out of plants. They rip big chunks. In this case, their V shape here is kind of a giveaway, but they're not always V-shaped. They just can rip big pieces. If you see a plant with a bite out of it across the veins, it's not likely to be an insect. Most of their jaws are too weak to cut across big veins. So it has to be a bird or a rabbit or something. And slugs can, I mean, this is what happens to hostas when slugs are around. And this is caterpillars, but there could also be slug damage on this leaf as well. It's not always just one problem. When you see brown spots on leaves, it could be fungi or bacteria. It could be sun scald, sun injury. I'll show you a picture in a minute of hail damage that came out, doesn't show up till a few weeks after the hailstorm, by which time you've forgotten there was a hailstorm. And now you've got weird little spots on the leaves. If a plant wilts, what are we looking at here? Root disease could be, root insects could be, high temperatures, the plant just gave up the ghost, it got too hot. Maybe it's too dry, maybe you don't realize how dry the soil is. Maybe there's voles underneath the roots. So this is not easy. And this is a really common situation where you find a good bug in a bad situation. And now this is a lady beetle, so there's something hinky about this picture. So what's happening here is the lady beetle is eating these little tiny sawfly larvae. I don't know if you saw those in this slide. Did you see these little guys? You probably wouldn't in a garden because this is a very close-up picture. It's very common to see damaged leaves with insects on those leaves. And in fact, those are beneficial insects that are looking for the pest to kill it or eat it or lay an egg in it or something. And this is quite common too in soil. It's long, it's about, half an inch, centimeter, a little more than a centimeter long insect in the soil. And a lot of people think it's a wireworm, but it's a predator of wireworms. This is a wireworm here. You see this creature is the same dimensions. The only thing different really is it's kind of pale cream color instead of that more yellow that wireworms are. But it's a fly maggot. It's a stiletto fly, and it's poked a hole in the wireworm and killed it. So don't assume you found the culprit if you see an insect on a damaged leaf. And again, it's not easy. I'll show you two confusing pictures here. This is a lady beetle larva. It's a little black beetle. It's eating a scale insect, a cottony scale insect. So this bit of white fluff here is a sap-sucking insect that's attacking the leaf, being eaten by this larva. Over here, though, the white fluff is a larva of another kind of lady beetle. So this is lady beetle, but this is a different kind of lady beetle, and it's eating these aphids. So it's really, really, look closely. Don't make any quick decisions about what you think you're seeing. Now, as I said earlier, many plant problems are actually disorders or injury, of physical injury, extreme temperature. Here's the hail picture. This shows up about a week to 2 weeks after the hailstorm. All of a sudden, there's little ding marks all over everything. Chemicals. People think, well, I don't use chemicals, but people put salt on their sidewalks. They spray soap on things, sulfur sprays, which, are still allowed. People might spray those, and those can damage leaves too. Soil conditions like nutrient deficiencies and wrong pH and poor watering or waterlogging, all of these things. This poor little plant was extremely healthy, beautiful eggplant seedling that had been grown under lights, and the person put it out in the garden. And this is all that happened. Sun killed it. It got a severe sunburn because it wasn't used to the full spectrum sunlight, and it died. So this is nothing to do with pests or diseases. And we're seeing a lot of sun scald. Here's on rhododendron, but fruit can be burned. This is these little drupelets turning gray and brown on raspberries. That's heat. This is heat injury. When the damage is between the leaf veins on the part of the leaf sort of farthest from where the sap is traveling in the stems, that's typical of sun or heat injury or sun scald. And here we have the same thing on young leaves, rhodo leaves. We see a lot of weird growth abnormalities. Again, this is a pollination problem. It could have been too cold, but it could have been too hot. This is heat, effective heat on cauliflower. This is heat and drought on sweet corn. Everything goes wrong. This is bright heat, hot weather directly on tomatoes. You would think that people think of tomatoes as a hot season crop. They're not. They're a warm season crop. And they don't do well with bright sunlight shining straight onto the shoulders of the fruit. These cells that are green stay green and they'll never ripen. And this is tomato that's been injured by sun and now, or heat rather, well, sun scald. And the tissue that's been killed or injured is now rotting because a decomposing fungus has come in and is now working away on this tissue. So the first time you see this, you think, well, it's got this terrible fungus disease, but it didn't start out that way. It started with an injury that killed the cells that then got a decomposer in there. Things go quite wrong on a lot of our vegetables when the weather is extreme, hot or cold, or just swinging widely from one extreme to another. That causes things to have, like our cabbage family can have button heads. That little cauliflower is all that's ever going to happen now. It's done. It's about the size of a loonie. This is Brussels sprouts that have shot off to seed. There will be no sprouts. Once this has happened, the sprouts are not going to form. This is chard that's flowering prematurely. Go back and review vernalization, talking about the spring vegetables and why biennial vegetables should be sown later so that they don't get this chance to have a fake winter, a cold weather causing them to be faked out and flower in their first year. So if you need to review those slides, go do that, because that's a very common problem in gardens on the coast here, is vernalized biennial plants. They're hardy, so we start them early. The weather is really variable. It's hot and then it's cold, and then the plant thinks winter has come, and suddenly we've all got flowers on our vegetables in the first summer when they shouldn't be flowering. Metabolic disorders are, there's a couple that are quite common. And it's a big interaction between everything that goes on with the plant, from the way the plant's metabolism works, to the weather that's been going on, to the things that you do to take care of it. Somebody still has their microphone on. Could everybody just check that you're muted until you want to talk? I keep getting there's little whispers here that pop up. And the upshot of this is that it's really complicated, and you can't tease apart exactly what the cause is usually. However, a lot of them have to do with calcium deficiency. That's a very common metabolic disorder. Now, the calcium is in the soil. The plant has to get it from the roots, but if it's too hot or dry, the plants close up their stomata on the leaves, and they're not photosynthesizing anymore, and they are not transpiring, so they are not getting any nutrients from the soil. So a plant that is sitting in dry soil or where the weather is just too hot actually is not moving nutrients through its tissues. And if it's as if it was sitting, it's as if it's getting has a calcium deficiency in the soil, but it doesn't. There's plenty of calcium there. It can't get it. And calcium is a difficult element to move, for plants to move around internally. Plants move nitrogen around internally quite a bit more easily. Calcium is not moved easily. So when a plant has to shut down, experience a calcium interruption, it takes a while for that to catch up and get the calcium back to its cells again when, say, maybe the temperature cools down or you start watering the plant. So it's a couple really common things occur. One is blossom end rot, and this really looks like a nasty disease. This was a grower on Salt Spring some years ago that lost probably about $3,000 worth of fruit in a greenhouse where the irrigation system wasn't working during the heat wave. And the plants, every plant that had fruit at that sensitive time during that 2 or 3 days of interruption of their irrigation, all of the fruit had blossom end rot. But it sounds like a disease name, but it's not. It's a calcium deficiency. And the same thing has happened to this lettuce. And so these things look like diseases. There is actually another one called bitter pit in apple, which is the same kind of problem. It's a calcium deficiency in the cells in the apple, but it's usually not got anything to do with a calcium problem in the soil. It has to do with heat or drought or the movement of calcium around the plant. So we're trying to decide whether we're looking at a disease or a disorder. You can see that a lot of these pictures, they look pretty crummy and they look like the plant has got a disease. But here's some things to think about. If it's a pathogen, if it's a disease, it's probably it should be limited to just one kind of plant. Might just be one variety or cultivar, it might be one genus or certainly one plant family. But if it's on all kinds of plants that are unrelated, say in a flower bed or a vegetable bed, and they all have weird looking things going on, then it's obviously something wrong with the growing conditions if many different unrelated plants have the problem. If spores are present, that helps you tell you it's a fungus disease. And usually pathogens generally start with the oldest tissue or the sickest tissue or the weakest tissue first, and they progress. And they don't necessarily progress very quickly. Late blight's the only thing that progresses so fast that your tomatoes just go down and die. Everything else progresses really slowly, and you've got time to watch it and see if it's a problem. If it's a disorder, though, if the conditions are improved, suddenly the new growth will look fine. Here's some badly sunburned grapes, and it looks like a disease, but here all the new leaves are looking fine. So it's and weather is an important clue for both of them. Is it the kind of wet weather that a certain fungus disease would thrive in, or have we just had awfully hot weather and the plants weren't shaded and were they damaged or frosted or whatever? So weather is a clue, and then some of these other clues will help you figure out whether you're looking at a disease or not. Now, before I start on this section on monitoring, it's time to take a break. But first, I want to ask if there are any questions, and then I'm going to pause the recording and we're going to take a 10-minute break. So any questions so far? Everybody needs a break. They're tired of looking at bugs. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to get my... Okay, so we're going to take a break. I am trying to get my screen to come up here so that I can... there we go. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so the whole section preceding this was about prevention and then correct identification. Now I'm moving on to the part where you follow the problem along. You keep an eye on the problem, and this helps to tell you whether the problem is getting better, getting worse, if there's natural enemies present. So what this really is looking closely and keeping records. So, get a hand lens that's easy to look through, or use the magnifying, the zoom lens, the zoom function on your cell phone camera, whatever, something where you can look really closely. And you're looking for signs of diseases or insect eggs in this case. Keep notes though. And now that it's easy to keep photos, so easy to keep photos, do that, because many things, problems occur at the same time every year. A lot of insects just have one generation a year. They're only out at a certain time. After that, the damage may still be there, but there's nothing you can do about it. And you may notice that there's some plants that are much less affected by the pest problem or the disease. And it would be good to know that. And I am always, whenever people, show me a problem plant, I always want to know what variety it is. Just get in the habit of always knowing and recording somewhere what varieties you're growing, because there's big differences between varieties. It's not that you can't grow cucumbers. It's just that this cucumber did better and this cucumber did worse. And if you know what you've got, then you can avoid a lot of problems. Just grow the things that do well. So what you're looking for is, as I said, is the problem getting better, or worse? And they don't necessarily get worse at all. If you come back a week later and nothing has essentially changed, or the new growth looks good and nothing is damaging it, that tells you a lot. If you're looking for beneficial insects, are they present? And, do you really need to do anything? If you also need to time some things correctly, there is a bacterial disease, the Bacillus thuringiensis, which is the Safer's biocontrol product, which we can use on tent caterpillars, but we can use on caterpillars. But it won't work on eggs of moths and butterflies, and it won't work on pupae. It only works on caterpillars that are big enough to eat a hole in a leaf, because they have to consume the bacteria, and the bacteria only last for 48 hours or something. So it helps time things when you're trying to do things that have a critical timing. And then if you did something, then your inspection is going to tell you if it worked or not. Because if you went out and sprayed this bacterial disease, when these eggs hatch, the little creatures that come out, the larvae look like caterpillars, but they're not. They're sawfly larvae. They look exactly like caterpillars, but this bacterial disease only affects caterpillars. So you would spray, come back and realize that everybody was looking pretty healthy. Then this should be a clue that this, didn't go the way you expected. It tells you what, where you're at in your program, and keep records. Be aware of recent weather. Even just a rudimentary tracking of weather. I actually track the weather pretty closely. I certainly track minimum temperature, maximum temperature, and precipitation just in a garden journal, just routinely. You may not want to do that, but try and at least make some notice so that did it hail? Was it frosty? How cold has it been? How hot did it get? Those are really going to be increasingly important things to know when we're trying to figure out what's going on with our gardens. So, if it's moist or wet, 2 weeks ago and everything is covered with a fungus here, a mildew fungus, that's the wet weather. If it's been, fairly dry, like it's high humidity, but dry weather, no rain and no dew, then the powdery mildews, that's likely what these problems are. And just remember, it's really, really lots of times you don't need to do anything. First, it may be because you have a personal tolerance that's pretty high. This looks ghastly. This poor cabbage has been slaughtered by, well, the outer leaves have just been slaughtered by that white cabbage butterfly, the imported currant worm or cabbage worm. And actually, I took this picture in China many years ago when I was working on a project, and there were so many insecticides that had been used that there was zero natural enemies around left to control anything. And this cabbage was just being mutilated, except it was only the outer layer. And if you had something that looked this bad and just peeled off the outer layer of leaves, nobody would even know that it had been attacked. On the other hand, this is the same caterpillar here, but it's attacking kale and it's eating the very part of the leaf I want to eat. So it really depends, you could tolerate a huge number of caterpillars in this situation. Maybe you can't even tolerate one in this situation. So it depends on the part of the plant that's being affected. Depends on what the damage is and how old it's been. In this case, this is quite a lot of damage to this leaf. It would be really good not to have had this much damage, but it's too late now. You can see the dry brown edges everywhere. when this injury happened was quite a while ago. And the little critter that did it is long gone. And also, again, if you look and you see natural enemies present, then no matter how bad it looks, you may not have to do anything. So look closely, especially for things like aphid predators. There are hundreds and hundreds of species of insects that attack aphids. Here is aphids on a peach leaf. This is a cluster of lady beetle eggs. This is a hoverfly or syrphid fly egg. Right now, there's already enough natural enemies on this leaf to completely wipe out those aphids. I would just walk away. I wouldn't even bother trying to do anything about the aphids because they are toast. This is a dill that had a lot of aphids. You don't see any on there now. And there's at least three lady beetle. These are a pupa, another pupa, and an adult that looks like it's just hatched out. So looking for natural enemies. This is on a plum leaf. And you turn it over and oh no, look at all these aphids, and you only see one hoverfly larva. And this is a different species than other ones I've showed you. They always look, they're larvae, and they look kind of, well, they don't really look like a slug on the leaf, but they definitely are ugly little critters. Some of them are variably gray. This one's a green one. Is that enough to do the job? Well, actually, there's plenty here to do the job because these are all hoverfly eggs. So that's why I say to look closely, because this is an aphid, this is a hoverfly egg. And already there's way enough hoverfly eggs that I can just see in this picture. There may be more that I can't see. It's quite likely years ago, I used to do I did a lot of research on aphid predators at one time. And we found that in the field that even very experienced people that knew exactly what they were looking for could only ever see about 1/10 of what was actually there. When we took the specimens back to the lab and reared them out, you'd see one aphid predator of any species. There were 10 more or 9 more in the sample bag that we would find later. So my rule of thumb is if you see one guy, there's probably 10. And that's actually what's going on here. These are all eggs that will hatch. So now deciding whether treatment is necessary, here's the damage from one caterpillar. It's a codling moth, and it's made all this mess in the apple. And there's one caterpillar that's a tussock moth, and it's eating leaves. It doesn't touch the apple. So this guy has done no damage of any significance whatsoever. And this one, it's wrecked the apple, except we can cut this piece out and make apple pie out of this apple. You can't sell this apple, and you wouldn't be able to store this apple. But in a home garden, it's not even still a completely wasted apple. So what's in the toolbox for treatments? I'm focusing on things that don't rely on toxicity to get the job done. And most of our garden pests, for food garden pests, can be managed with some kind of prevention or cultural controls or physical controls or biological controls, not by having to use a spray of some sort or a pesticide. But they work differently. Some controls work only on certain pests. Some depend on careful timing. If you put your carrot seeds out, let the seeds come up, and then come along later to put the barrier over the carrots, this whole system is not going to work because the carrot rust fly can find those carrots the minute they come up out of the soil. So it has to be done at the right time. So everything has to be used correctly to work. This is a water spray, by the way, and it actually works quite well. If you do 2 close together in time, that really controls aphids. So our first thing, and anybody that's, in the tent caterpillar zone this year has been done this one, physically removing things, insects and eggs. And, she's snipping out tent caterpillar nests really early on. So they're still quite small and there's very little damage to the tree. So you can remove that. It's quite feasible. Pruning out infected branches. For example, this is a branch with European canker on it. This was one of my apple trees. It rubbed on a support stake, got canker. I cut it out of the tree, and it's probably 12 or 13 years ago. And I have never had any European canker back in the tree. So these things really do work if you just get on them and do them at the right time. There are a lot of sanitation steps. In the case of pear trellis rust, which I mentioned earlier, If you've got a pear tree, you may start now seeing little orange spots on the leaves. This is a rust fungus, a fungus disease that lives on pears in the summer. It's on the trees, and in the late in the summer, these weird structures happen, and the spores go to juniper, and they're not in the pear tree anymore. They're in the juniper, and then in the spring, in April, they come from the juniper and they move to pear. So one way to control the problem is to remove the infected juniper if you can find it. Unfortunately, it's probably not your juniper. It's usually somebody else's juniper, but it's not a serious disease, and that we don't really have to worry about it that much. But brown rot is something that can wipe out your entire crop of plums, of soft fruit, of stone fruit, plums, peaches, nectarines, cherries. Or you can very easily, in winter when the tree is dormant, these mummified fruit that gets stuck on the tree, you can just knock them out with a stick. That's where the fungus is overwintering. You knock these mummified fruit out of the tree, pick them all up and put them in the garbage. It's really easy to do, and it's extremely effective. But if you don't do it, in the spring, these spores germinate and the rain carries them to all the blossoms on the tree, and you could lose an entire crop after a few years of infection. So it's a case of a disease that's so easy to clean up through sanitation, and so fatal if you don't. Oh, picking up dropped fruit, certain fruit pests, the fruit drops early if it's infested, and pick it up the day it falls and destroy it. If it's got codling moth, you can just drop it in a bucket of soapy water until the caterpillars come out, and then you can compost the apples if you want to. We do have some pests for which there are traps that work quite well. The winter moth, which is comes out in the winter, oddly enough, the moths are their cocoons are down here in the soil, and in the fall, like after October, basically, the male and female moths emerge from their cocoons. The males can fly away, but the females actually don't have functional wings. They just have these little stubs. So the female proceeds to walk up the tree all the way out to the end of the branches and lay her eggs. And then these little green caterpillars feed on the leaves in the spring and drop on little silken strings. And I don't know if any of you that are on Salt Spring remember some years ago, the treehouse tree that's in the middle of one of our local restaurants was completely covered with these caterpillars that kept dropping on people's dinner plates because nobody knew that they had winter moth. But easily intercepted because the females have to walk. If you put a sticky band between where they hatch out and where they're going to head, they get caught on it. But this only works on winter moth because of the special feature of their biology, which is they're out in the wintertime and the females can't fly. If you put sticky bands like that on a tree in the summer, you do a lot of damage. You intercept a lot of beneficial insects, and kids are always getting their hair stuck in it, and bicycle seats and dog tails, and it's just a mess. But you put these bands up I always put them up on Canadian Thanksgiving and take them down the end of January, early February. And that is enough to intercept that moth really well. We can use yellow sticky traps for some pests indoors, not outdoors. We also catch some beneficial insects outdoors, but in a greenhouse or a tunnel or a window garden, you can easily catch whiteflies on yellow traps. This potato chunks works really well for trapping wireworms out of our vegetable garden soil before we plant. So you prepare the bed, bury chunks of potatoes with a stick on it. I showed you this earlier when we were talking about growing potatoes in the spring, and attract the wireworms, and then you can destroy them, and you can put the trap right back and catch some more. Water sprays work well. This is really a physical control because you're blasting them off. When aphids get blasted off of leaves, it breaks their mouth parts and they can't suck sap. They can still have a few babies though, because they give birth to live babies. They have eggs inside them that hatch, and then they give birth to a live aphid. So that's why you need to do a spray 2 days later, very quickly after the first spray, because what you want to catch is the survivors and the young ones before they reproduce. So yeah, water sprays work really well. There's certain kinds of this funny soft fly that gets on pear and cherry. It looks like little black slugs on the leaves. You wash them off with water and that's it. They can never come back. I guess they don't have any instinct to climb back up the tree. Powdery mildews actually are suppressed by water on the leaves because powdery mildews, there are many species, are fungi that can germinate in humid conditions, but not water, not wet conditions. They are fungi of dry weather. Insect barriers. Now this is a review slide. You saw this before, but I'm just going to make a complete set here. Anytime you're using a barrier to manage a pest problem, it's essential that it gets put on at the right time. It has to be put on before the pests show up. Because once they're there, they're under the barrier. And in this case, if they were carrot rust flies and they were already in your carrots, they would actually be protected from their enemies. They would reproduce it. They would have several generations in here and completely destroy the carrots. So to stop them from laying their eggs on the fruit or the leaves or the roots or whatever it is, you've got to get them in there at the right time. And this is, again, a review slide. This is the cabbage root maggot barrier. You want a really, really tight fit here. You don't want any gap at all around that stem so that the insect doesn't find some little crack to lay her eggs. So that's why soft material, you know, I love compost bags. They're just perfect for cutting up into squares like this. But as long as it's waterproof and soft enough not to break the stem. And I cut a little slit either way, just quite small, just enough that you can get that stem in there and really get a tight, tight fit. And you leave it in place for the life of the plant. You can cover whole plants. This is a whole cherry tree. It's keeping out fruit flies. Quite a variety of fruit flies that attack cherries, but also keeps birds out while we're at it. And this is keeping out another kind of fruit fly on currants. And in this case, it only needs to be present for about 3 weeks. And then I just unclip the clothespins and use this piece of insect netting on something else. And this is keeping fruit flies out of strawberries. You can use floating row cover on something like strawberries or carrots or cabbage family things because they're soft. But if you're going to cover bushes and trees, you really need to use the proper insect netting because it won't rip. They're fairly pricey, but they last a long time. I've had my insect netting for 10 or 11 years now, and it looks brand new. So that's a Protect Net, but any of these brands work fine. You can, rather than cover a whole tree, you can just cover the individual fruit. That sounds tedious, but you only do it once, and it prevents all kinds of pest problems. So if you can cover an apple, cover your apples, you don't get apple maggot, but you don't get birds, you don't get rats, you don't get insects that are, you know, that can attack the skin. You don't get apple scab disease. It's very interesting. These are homemade bags that I put on my grapes every year. I've been doing this for more than 20 years. This keeps raccoons out. And now that we have fruit flies as well, it's incidentally also keeping fruit flies out. So once you go this route, you actually solve a lot of pest problems at once. So paper bags, wax paper, these are organza gift bags that you can buy wholesale, or you can sew bags out of insect netting or anything. It's another approach. Now moving on to biological, so those are all physical barriers: fruit, individual fruit, whole plants, whole beds, or around the stems of cabbage family plants. Those are all crafted to fit the species of pest problem for that plant. We also have biological controls, and the biocontrol is a living thing that controls another living thing. So it could be an insect controlling an insect, or a mite that controls mites, or it could be a pathogen that controls insects like the bacterial disease for caterpillars. If they eat it, they get sick and die. And and you can buy them, but there's a few commercially produced species, but very few of them are useful for a garden. Most of them are for the large commercial crops in the big greenhouses. Over in the Lower Mainland, those huge greenhouse blocks, Most of them are using biological control very, very accurately. There's a very particular range of pests that they have, and they can buy predators for them. And those Dutch growers, they knew exactly what they wanted in the 1980s, and they built up this whole industry. Along with it, they wanted the biological controls to be available to them. So, and most of what you can buy is for that kind of production. It's not really that useful for outdoors in a garden, but outdoors in a garden, we have thousands of species that are native here. So rather than buying one species that attacks aphids, we can attract hundreds of species that attack aphids, hundreds of species that attack caterpillars. So here's just some examples of a few of the aphid predators. I've showed you some of these slides. These are all different lady beetle larvae. These are hoverflies. This is the aphid midge. You'll never see the adult. It looks like a little miniature mosquito, but you'll never see it. It's so tiny, and it's only out at dusk. But you might see these little orange maggots. They never get bigger than aphids, so they be in among the aphids. Lots and lots of species of parasitic wasps. They could be attacking something. They could be very, very tiny. This is an egg of an insect, of caterpillar, of a moth that will become a caterpillar called the cranberry girdler. And these wasps are so tiny that several can emerge out of one moth egg. This is one that attacks whiteflies. This is one that gets in aphids. This is a tiny little one that's laying her egg in an aphid. So you can see that she's very small. But we do have bigger ones, and this would be one that's attacking our tent caterpillars. This is a native wasp. So they're all sizes. This is a huge one. And although the species we have here are black, they're not this yellowy color, we do have species that do this. This wasp is so strong and so big that she's drilling a hole with her ovipositor under bark and laying her eggs in a beetle larva that is boring in the bark of the tree underneath the bark. So she's gone along, sensed it with her antennae, and now she's made a drilling rig out of her body, and she's injecting an egg in there. So we've got all sizes of parasitic wasps. And I'll just give you, this is a review of the aphid situation. There's 3 species at least of aphid natural enemies here. There's that little orange maggot that is the aphid midge. Here is a big fat syrphid fly or hubbard fly larva. Here is a aphid that's been parasitized by that tiny little wasp, and eventually the wasp just turns the aphid's body into its own pupa case. So a lot of these aphids would be parasitized, but we can't tell yet until they turn into these little pearly, these little pearls on the leaves. And here's an aphid midge over here. And that's all the ones we can see easily. If we were to take this specimen into the, oh, actually, I think, oh, there's one there. I didn't put an arrow on that one. There's one there. If we had this in our hand and could poke around a little bit and look underneath, we would find lots more. So if I looked at an aphid colony and went, oh, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, oh, well, I'm done. I'm out of here. This is plenty of aphid predators to take care of this mess. We have parasitic flies, and everybody that's seen these little tent caterpillars with little white dots on their heads are the eggs of this fly. And it's a very nondescript fly. It just looks like kind of like a small house fly. You'd never notice it. But some of these species lay eggs on caterpillars, and others actually lay their larvae. They wait for the egg to hatch, and then they put the larva on the caterpillar. So how are we going to get these creatures to our garden? It's very simple. Almost all of these, the adult insect, remember the insects that have complete metamorphosis, the adults don't have the same diet as the larvae. In this case, the larvae are the killers. They're the ones that are killing the caterpillars, killing the aphids, eating the aphids, whatever. The adults of all of these need pollen or nectar or both. So they come to flowers, and they are attracted to gardens with flowers that are rich in nectar. So, and when the female comes and finds her own food, which is the nectar supply or the pollen supply, then she starts looking for places to lay her eggs. So she'll start searching where her food is for aphid colonies or caterpillars or whatever it is that she needs as a host for her larvae. And this is applied in agriculture quite broadly by interplanting, by planting in hedgerows, planting special plants that bring the natural enemies into the field. And in a garden, it's very effective. And you know, one of the quickest fixes for any garden is Sweet Alyssum, which is available at every garden center, comes easily from seed. It's just such a robust little plant. It has tiny little flowers, and you can smell them quite a ways away. It smells like honey, and that is the nectar. It is an amazing quick fix. But there's lots of other plants we can use. And if you've got copies of my books, any of them have lists of tables in there of the huge range of plants that will attract insects. In a vegetable garden, if you're planting dill and cilantro and parsley, let them go on and bloom and flower. That is amazing for attracting insects. The hoverflies really come to yellow flowers a lot. They quite like dandelions in the spring, and they like daisies, and they like calendula. And lots of creatures come to Sweet Alyssum, or if you're planting native plants, which is really advisable to also attract pollinators. Things like goldenrod and the native asters and yarrow. Those are all excellent plants. Just have them in a flower bed somewhere in the yard. And for a lot of them, because they're so tiny, it's the tiny flowers that are important. You know, a big foxglove, a bumblebee can get nectar from a foxglove flower, this huge bells, but a little tiny parasitic wasp will drown trying to get nectar out of that. The nectar pool is too big. So these tiny florets, lots and lots of little florets on these plants, this is what's most valuable. And I'll just show you, this was a slide set, a series I took. For a greenhouse, if you get aphids in a greenhouse crop, and I put peppers and sweet basil and things in my greenhouse, if I get aphids in there, the fastest fix is to have Sweet Alyssum in that greenhouse in bloom. Like I'll dig one up from the garden, or now I actually just always have Sweet Alyssum growing in my greenhouse. And the odor is so attractive that if you have the Sweet Alyssum blooming in there, open up the doors, take the screens off if you've got screens on the windows, and wait for the hoverflies to find those plants. And they come into the nectar smell and then immediately start laying eggs. And here she is, she's pasting an egg on the underside of this leaf. And this is a leaf, this is a typical mess that this greenhouse was in. There's aphids all over the pepper leaves here, but that's an egg, and there's probably other eggs that I can't see. This is the same leaf a week later. No aphids to be seen at all. Two big fat hoverfly larvae are here. So it's a fast fix for a greenhouse, is to just invite the natural enemies in by putting the food for the adults in the greenhouse. Insects need water in the summer. If there's no streams or wetlands or source of water around later in our dry summers, then providing water is actually quite helpful. It makes them live a lot longer. And it also attracts some pollinators. They need water too, but they need safe water. If they have, in this case, this kind of plasticky material, insects would fall in and just drown, which was easily remedied by putting a piece of slate in here and making a little beach. So insects can line up along the edge, or if they fall in and get caught in the surface tension, they can just swim over here and pull themselves out. The terracotta, the rough terracotta seems to work pretty well, but it always is a good idea to have a stone or something in a bird bath just to allow insects to pull themselves out again. Something else we can do is to protect these ground dwellers. Just remember there's lots of them there, and they're doing really important things like, for example, eating slug eggs and slugs, or pill bugs, or wireworms. So that kind of goes on beneath the radar. We don't really see it happening, but believe me, they're there. And anytime we disturb the soil a lot, it disturbs their lives. So if we have permanent pathways and we have some perennial plants and we're only cultivating the little piece of garden that we need to plant something now, that really protects them because it's minimizing the disturbance to their habitat. And anytime you have mulches or living plants covering the soil, that also makes really good habitat for them. So perennial plantings, undisturbed bits and areas. There's a little ground beetle larva. Another reason for minimizing cultivation is that the pupic cases, the pupal stage of the hoverflies or syrphid flies and the aphid midges and other insects are just in the surface of the soil. They go under the mulch and they go into the soil just a, very, a few millimeters deep or a quarter of an inch or something, but they'll be in there pupating. So if you were to run a rototiller through here, that would be the end of them. So using mulches to control weeds, and then they go under the mulch and they can climb out again safely. So the no-till idea for gardening doesn't just benefit the fungi and the beneficial fungi and the earthworms. It also benefits the beneficial insects. And never, ever use bug zappers. These things are really being heavily promoted now, and they're really, really being promoted in hardware stores and online, and oh, this is the best thing, and thousands of bugs will die, but they're not pests that are being killed. It's just insects generally are attracted to this bluish, cool LED light, and they get sizzled, and people hear the sizzle and think, wow, it's another dead bug, that's great, but it's terrible. In this one study, this was an earlier study using the old style bug zappers. In a 2-week period, in 6 bug zappers caught 14,000 insects, and only 31 were mosquitoes. I mean, you could kill that many mosquitoes with a fly swatter. The mosquitoes are basically in there by accident, because they don't come to the blue light. They come to the smell of carbon dioxide from your breath. So these electrocution devices are a complete scam, and they're really, really destructive because they kill so many insects. And I guess, there was somebody in my Monday class that had just been told by her friend how wonderful these were. And she had just spent I can't remember how much she told me it was. She bought one through Amazon, but she was going to return it. So don't buy them. Now, about buying biological controls, to beef the situation up, isn't there any point? In most of the cases, you don't need to do this, but if you had a really bad aphid population in orchard trees or in a greenhouse or in a valuable collection, some people might have a specialty crops in a greenhouse or a commercial crop. There may be some cases where it is worth it to buy a biocontrol for aphids, for example. And the one you would buy, which is available for sale, is the aphid midge. It's native here, it's common, but it is also sold to the industry, so you can get them. There are lots that are not worth, they wouldn't do anything for our gardens, and some are positively destructive, like praying mantis. A praying mantis is not a biological control in the sense, or it's not useful for biological control because they're what are called generalists. In this case, this insect over here just eats aphids. In the case of a praying mantid, they eat anything they can catch. So they eat butterflies, they eat lacewings, which are really good little aphid predators. They might eat grasshoppers, that's what's in this picture. They eat whatever they can catch, and it is not pressure on pest populations, they just eat insects. So when they're little, they eat little things, and when they're bigger, they eat bigger things. They're also not native, and we don't want them introduced here, and unfortunately, they've become established in a few places, and Salt Springers will know where I'm talking about in Burgoyne Bay. We have an established population of praying mantids there now, which is not benefiting anything. So don't be, fall for the idea that you can let praying mantis egg masses out and have them do anything. They do nothing good in your garden. So yes, there's some things that you might want to use. You need to know what you're doing. They're perishable, so you need to know where you're going to get them from and use them promptly. But mostly we're relying on the wild ones. You can buy insect parasitic nematodes. This is a little worm. Well, it's actually, there are a number of different species that are sold. They're very tiny parasitic worms. So this is under a microscope picture here. They're very hard to, we really can't see them by your naked eye. You can water them into the soil, and they attack the larval stage of grubs. European chafer beetle, or that gets into sod. There are ones that attack the weevils that attack the roots of strawberries or rhododendrons. So they can work pretty well for certain insects if they're put on at exactly the right time. The problem I have with nematodes generally is that because they are not subjected to the pesticide registration rules like bacterial diseases would be, because bacteria fall under the pesticide rules, but nematodes are a bigger organism and they don't, and they're not registered. So companies make all kinds of claims that are not going to, they don't work. So you'll see on the labels that they're effective against wireworms and pill bugs and earwigs and all kinds of things that they will not work on when you put it in the garden. In a laboratory, these nematodes will attack almost anything if they're trapped in a petri dish with it. So if you put a pill bug or an earwig in a petri dish with enough insect parasitic nematodes, sooner or later, they're going to get inside that insect. They get in through the mouth or the anus or the breathing holes or something. But in a soil system, it doesn't work like that. In the real world, they just don't work against a lot of these things they're supposed to be working on. But they are very good on weevils. And if you get the right species, they work on the chafers that are in lawns, things like that. They're quite expensive. And this is the bacterial disease that I mentioned. This is a biological control because it is a living organism that's being used to kill caterpillars in this cases. So it only lasts for a few days, and the ultraviolet rays of the sun kill the bacteria. But you can kill other caterpillars. You don't want to put it everywhere. You only want to kill the caterpillars that are pests on your food crop. So you don't want to be spraying it indiscriminately. You just put it where there's a problem. 10 caterpillars, it works on them. There are some other bacterial diseases now that are being sold for beetles, mosquitoes. There used to be one for Colorado potato beetle, which doesn't really matter to us because we don't really have Colorado potato beetle here, which is good. When it comes to pesticides, even the least toxic pesticides should be like the last resort. This is like the chemotherapy. This is not the first place to go. This is the desperate case. Because if it is registered and will kill pests, it will kill beneficials. So you need to be careful what you're doing. The only one that really doesn't kill beneficials is the bacterial disease because it's specific to caterpillars. So if a lady beetle comes along, it doesn't have any effect on the lady beetle. Even if they ate it, it wouldn't hurt them. So oil, pyrethrin, soap, these are products that will kill beneficials as well. A slug bait only kills slugs, so that's pretty specific. But the fungicides, sulfur and lime sulfur, unfortunately, we can't get this bacterial pathogen anymore. Well, at least right now. It was available for years. It was a Canadian product. Then it was sold to a US company. They stopped making it available in Canada. But even this year, it's not available in the US now. So I don't know if we're ever going to get it back. But sulfur and lime sulfur are chemicals that are effective for certain diseases, certain pathogens, but they also kill beneficial mites on leaves. Then those mites have a role in keeping pest mites down. So if there's a pathogen that this works on and you need to spray, well, these tools are here, but there's no reason to be spraying routinely. If you don't have the pest problem, don't spray. And that's my big beef against dormant oil sprays. Is it used to always be that, well, you're just supposed to use dormant oil sprays on your fruit trees in the winter. Why do you do it? Well, you just do it. No, why? Well, you just do it. It's a routine cleanup. Well, no pesticide should ever be used as a routine cleanup. It should be used if there is a pest problem that is not being dealt with in any other way, then it justifies the use of the spray. So, I mean, nobody would go for cancer treatment with chemotherapy if they didn't have cancer. So one of the problems with oil sprays is they don't work on a lot of things that people think they do work on. They wouldn't help with tent caterpillars, for example. Even though the tent caterpillar eggs are on the trees in the winter, the egg masses are very protected, so the oil won't hurt them. It doesn't work on codling moth. There are some things that if you had scale on your apple trees, this is really, I've never seen anything this bad usually, but scale on an apple tree like this, for sure, I would do a dormant oil spray that winter, and it cleans up scale just beautifully. But if you don't have the pest that it works on, then there's absolutely no reason to do a routine spray. You may be familiar with some of the botanical insecticides, especially the one from Pyrethrum daisies. Organic growers use this. It's actually quite a potent neurotoxin. It can knock a bee right out of the sky in no time. It is a nerve toxin. Because it's a natural source, people feel safer using it, but you shouldn't ever breathe it, and you shouldn't really use it unless you absolutely have done everything else, and this is an important thing to do. I mean, unless you really are justified by the pest problem at the time, because it has a very fast knockdown, and it will kill anything it gets on. And homemade sprays, people are more comfortable sometimes making things like their own soap spray, or, you know, all kinds of, actually, I've seen some pretty strange concoctions. These can damage leaves. They can kill plants. You can take soap or detergent, put it on a plant leaf, and really fry that leaf. On top of the fact that if it's a homemade spray, it'll still kill beneficial insects and mites. And I didn't even talk today really about how many fungi are naturally on leaves that are beneficial and are preventing the fungi that cause diseases from getting into the leaves. There's a whole microbial ecosystem on the surface of leaves. And if we screw that up with sprays, then we can make it easier for the pathogens to actually get into the leaf. Another thing that happens with any spray, and even our homemade sprays, is that the odor of the plant changes. So, and many years ago, when I was doing research, I proved this quite to my satisfaction, that if you spray a plant that has aphids on it with pyrethrins, for example, or soap, sooner or later the aphids come back because the soap, everything breaks down. But the aphid predators won't come back. They would not come back and lay their eggs on those leaves that have been treated. They would only lay their eggs where there was new growth that never had been sprayed with soap or pyrethrins. So even though I had the insects in cages, the plants were inside cages with the beneficial insects trapped in there, they would not lay their eggs on those leaves. So we have some really subtle things here that we don't realize we're doing when we spray anything. We stinky up the leaves so the natural enemies won't come. We can wreck the fungi that are beneficial that we don't see, and we can kill the other beneficial insects and mites that we don't see. So if it works, it's going to do just as much damage as a registered pesticide. So when it comes to managing pests generally, prevention is the most reliable way to control damage and prevent damage. And think about just putting up a barrier and not having carrot rust fly. That's it. You're done. Your carrots are perfect. The bugs are not there. And that's the only pest you have to worry about in carrots. And so once you just take that into your gardening routine, that when you put your carrots in and you put your barrier on and you're finished, you don't have to think about it for the rest of the season. So prevention is really reliable. But when you're dealing with trying to figure out what the problem is, correct identification is essential. There's not really anything you could do if you don't know what the problem actually is. Then, you can follow problems along and keep records, and you can make some decisions about whether it's getting worse, getting better, natural enemies are arriving to the rescue. Decide if you need to treat. There's nothing automatic about the fact that you do need to treat. It often isn't necessary. You can combine a number of different methods. You can do some preventative methods, and you could do a touch-up spray in one place, and the rest of the time you're relying on a different method altogether. And always check whatever you did or didn't do, follow up and see what the result was. And then that will help you plan for next year. When I first moved to Salt Spring, I'm up in, an area where there's not many gardens. And I had moved from an area over on the Saanich Peninsula that was just oh, the carrot rust flies over there were so bad that you couldn't put a carrot seed in the ground without it being attacked. So I was used to having to cover every carrot as soon as it was planted in the spring, and then my winter carrots as well. When I got here, there wasn't any carrot rust fly up here, and I got really complacent. It was like, oh man, there's no problem here. They haven't reached my garden. And they're not bad in the spring here. There's very few. And so I don't bother covering my carrots in the spring because there's not enough damage to worry about. It's just a fuss. But the carrots that I plant on July 1st, they can get wiped out by the second and third generation of carrot rust flies, which I learned to my cost one year. So now I don't bother about covering the spring ones, but I do cover the winter crop carrots because I know there's some carrot rust flies around. Once they get under there, into the carrots, they'll just reproduce and could be a total crop loss by winter. So, plan for prevention next year and get familiar with the controls that you need to use, and then just forget about the rest of this because you won't see all these pests and diseases in every garden. Now, this reference section, we've got time here to do lots of questions, and I can flip through to different pest problems if you want to focus on anything in particular, but I'm done with the main part of the slides. So I'll just show you the kind of things that here, each section has a list, and this is the list of the vegetable pests that are in this section. And then we go to the diseases, the fruit tree pests, I guess, and then that's what's here. And then we'll come to the vegetable diseases. And then there's a section with the fruit diseases. So is there any burning questions about particular pests or anything I've covered tonight?
I have a question. It's Susan speaking.
Hiya.
Hi. I have one little rose in a pot and it gets sawfly.
Yes.
And so this year I was checking it and I thought, oh, I found some insecticidal soap in my cupboard. So I sprayed it. But now I'm wondering if I shouldn't have done that.
Believe it or not, sawfly, they're funny little critters. You can wash them off with water and they won't come back.
Oh,
And then you haven't stinkied up the leaf that would prevent aphid predators from coming if you needed them.
okay.
So it just happens for some reason that sawflies are rather feeble little creatures once they get washed off. So if it truly was sawfly, then I would just say wash them off with water. And then, you'll probably be fine having used the soap, but again, you can see there's drawbacks to the soap.
Yeah.
So water works in this particular case. So I would just use water.
Okay. I shall hose them down top and bottom to get
Yeah.
any soap off. Great. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Anybody else having any pest or disease problems?
So what do you do about aphids that are protected by ants? Like what?
Yeah, that's a hard one because the ants do protect the aphids. They protect.
do.
They go in and they will actually. There's a hilarious video. I wonder if you could find it on YouTube. It was a real close-up of a lady beetle in an aphid colony, and so the lady beetle looks huge, just like a flying saucer. And you see these ants come, and they each grab one leg of the lady beetle, and they hot frog march it off the leaf and push it off the leaf. And it's like they just turn this huge lady beetle off and then kick it off the plant. So
You're
yes,
out of here.
Yeah, they're like, wow, there he goes. So no, ants are a problem. But they're also temporary. They're only kind of busy in the first part of the summer. And so, if you really have to, you can put ant bait out, the boric acid ant baits to control them.
Okay.
And that often changes the picture entirely for aphids. But also it can just be a matter of time, or you can blast them with water. And that wrecks the lives of the ants as well, because you've just busted up their aphid colony. So if the natural enemies can't do the job because the ants are protecting them, the water sprays still work.
Yeah, I just squished them. All the ants, everybody.
Yeah, but the problem with that is,
What?
well, yeah, it's not, it's something that's being attacked by ants, or sorry, protected by ants isn't likely to have much in the way of aphid predators in there. But when people see aphids on a stem and they do the squish method, and it's not an ant situation, they are almost always killing a huge number of eggs and larvae that they can't see.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, because the squish method, it's like, it's final for everybody.
Yeah,
You
right,
know,
we're
so-
washing off the
Yeah, no,
beneficials
washing off-
will survive.
Well, washing off does less damage. I mean, washing off isn't going to do the eggs of any beneficial insect any good. But a lot of the larvae will walk right back up and the adults will fly right back up onto the plant. So you do the least harm to beneficial insects with a water spray.
Yeah, yeah. And one more thing I was gonna ask you about, I used the square
Little
squares
barriers?
yeah, those barriers under the
Mm.
kales. And I found that the cell bugs or the pill bugs, I'm not sure which ones, I think the cell bugs really liked the moisture that was created there. And they actually gnawed out the stems. And then I lost some transplants because of that. I'm sure.
Well, the transplants must have been really small because usually, I mean, when a seedling is, say it's tiny, tiny little seedling, a pill bug can damage it. But
No,
once the seedling is like a couple inches high, the tissue
thought-
is usually too tough for their little jaws. It might have been something else that chewed on that.
maybe it was, but there were an awful lot of them. Like when I
Yeah.
pulled away the square, they were right
Yeah.
at the base of the toppled transplant.
Well, if it was toppled, it probably wasn't pill bugs.
Well, gouged out stem,
Oh,
should-
okay.
I guess not really
Yeah.
toppled, but just, and wilted because
What
of it.
time of year? How early in the
Well, that
season?
would have been in May, sometime in May. I
Huh.
missed the last class. I was going to tell you about it. So before the last class, so beginning of
Yeah.
May.
Well,
Yeah.
that could have been a caterpillar or a slug.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
it
just-
could have
it's
been.
just- It isn't that
Yeah.
likely that a pill bug could do that kind of damage to a plant.
Right,
of
but
that
the
age.
many of them, it was gross, like they were.
Well, their
horrible.
jaws are just so weak that it doesn't really matter how
Oh.
many there are. They just can't
Yeah.
chew.
So,
But they could kill a tiny seedling, but literally just as it's coming out of the seed.
no, these were strong transplants.
Yeah,
so I'm sure-
I'm wondering if
so-
a slug or something might have liked
So-
that. environment.
I guess my comment is that the square was creating kind of moist conditions there for the slug or whoever to live there and then, kind of
Well, just mulch right on over the top of it and get those ground
Yeah.
beetles living under the mulch. No,
Yeah.
seriously, I just mulch right
Yeah.
over the top and,
Yeah,
I do have pill bugs in the garden, but I haven't really seen that. Mind you, I haven't looked under there. But I
Yeah.
suspect that,
it
I
was,
don't think
it
they
could have
did
been
the
slugs
chewing.
for sure.
Yeah, I don't think they did the chewing. They just can't. Their jaws are just.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions? Anything anybody wants me to look up here in this great list of colony law? We're in the midst of tent caterpillars right now here. We're just about over. Anyway, if there's no questions, I'm going to stop sharing here. Oh, I'm trying to find my, here we are, stop recording. Yes, I'm going to stop.